everyone, this is Joel with Tom Ward and Rod Smiths. I'm here with our guest today, Brandin. Kind of continuing the series for our 25th anniversary, talking about some of the people that knew Tom well, worked with him, fished with him, and kind of collecting some of their remembrances. You may or may not have heard of Per before. He is, in my humble opinion, being new to this world, probably the preeminent bamboo rod maker that we have right now. He's been making rods for 37 years, almost 40 years. Yeah. Yep. Highly collectible rods, but also is a great contemporary and colleague and friend of Tom's, and has numerous stories and experiences that he shared with Tom over the years. So we just want to kind of gather some of those things and share them with you today. So welcome, yeah. Thank you. And I'd be neglectful if I didn't mention, he also just wrote a wonderful book about E.C. Powell. It's called A Fly Rod with a Soul. I've got a copy here. We've got a couple copies in the shop. And we're looking forward certainly to him sharing that book with you and you picking that up as well. Wonderful history of E.C. Powell and his influence in bamboo rod making.
Yeah, and actually Tom was a big fan of E.C. Powell also.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Tom actually wrote the foreword for this book, I guess, too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he wrote well, there's a foreword and a preface.
That's right.
Hoagie wrote one, Tom wrote the other.
Yep.
So I can never remember which is which. So anyway, yeah, thanks for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to think back on Tom and the way I knew him for many years. Tom was a remarkable man, a pretty unique man in many ways. I knew Tom. I guess I met Tom. The way I met Tom was that I bought a bamboo rod when Tom still owned Winston. And that would have been in probably the mid to late 1970s. And I had bought and sold rods. I bought Leonard's, Gary Howell's, a Dennis Bailey, an Orvis, various rods, and I was trying to feel my way into rods. So one of the rods I bought was a 7.5 foot 5-line rod from Winston, which was Glenn Brackett and Tom Morgan, who were, making that rod at that time. And I wish I still had the correspondence with Tom because, I was young and really arrogant and really stupid. And I was talking about fishing the Henry's Fork. And then I was looking for a bamboo rod for the Henry's Fork. And I was talking about making 80-foot casts to like rising trout. And I remember Tom's response. He was so, you could tell he had to really stop himself from laughing.
Pulling back a little bit.
Because he wrote back, he said, well, I fished the Henry's Fork quite a bit. And I have to say that from my experience, an 80-foot cast is quite unusual.
That's a diplomatic way of saying that, right? Calling BS on you.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And you grew up fishing in Henry's Fork, also the Madison, right? Like you were there as a young man, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, I fished the Madison. So what happened with me coming out to Montana was, you guys had the earthquake in 1959 that created Quake Lake, really changed the and the word was that the Madison was toast for a while. And then sometime in the mid-60s, I read this article in Outdoor Life or Field and Stream, and it said the Madison is back. And it talked about the Madison as being the greatest trout river on earth. And I was already into fishing, and I would get my dad to take us fishing. I said, oh, Dad, look at this article. We got to go, man. We got to go. And so we did. We started coming out to the Madison. Also because we discovered we had some distant relatives in Montana. Mm-hmm. Like we actually had cousins who ran the farm where Rock Creek flows into the Clark Fork.
Oh, right.
So we spent a lot of time there for years also.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how we started coming to Montana. And of course, in those days, my dad would hire a guide to float the Madison River. And in those days, if you saw 3 or 4 boats, it was a really busy day.
Sure.
Wow, a lot of people fishing the river today.
It's kind of like that now.
It's pretty different now. But And also, we would usually stay at the El Western Motel. However we discovered that place, I don't know, but of course Tom's family built that place.
Right.
And I'll always remember, and they said I've stayed there before and I've talked to them about them. They had these fly plates, like these kind of shadow box plates up in the front with the different sofa pillow and Bloody Butcher, all the different flies. You know, so I would go in and look at those, and that's, oh yeah, you gotta fish those on this river. And Tom was guiding at that time. And I wish I still had it, and I lost it in a house fire. I used to have a brochure of Tom's guiding business. When we were staying at the El Western, for $35 you could float to Madison. And he also had multiple day trips. And I forget if that was the Madison or some other rivers around where you would actually float and camp for 2 or 3 days, which was neat. So anyway, that's kind of how I heard of this guy, Tom Morgan.
Right.
You know, but I never met him, you know, as a kid.
Did you have that connection when you met him through Winston, that he had been the guide at the Western? Did you remember the Western? Did you remember?
Yes, yeah. I kind of found that out through, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I kind of remembered the old brochures I had about his guiding and that stuff.
Yep.
And I mean, Tom was also, he was kind of a legend around Ennis. You know, I mean, people knew Tom Morgan. He owned the fly shop there for years, and he was just known as a superb angler. You know, it's a little bit like E.C. Powell in Red Bluff. Everybody thought of him as like the angler of Red Bluff. I think Tom was a little bit that way in Ennis. And I got to know these guides who Tom also knew, McFeeters, McGuire, and there were some other. Those were the main guys, and they basically taught me to fly fish. And I'll always remember McFeeters, the first time we floated with him. I would spin fish because I was really good with the MEPS.
Yeah.
And I could catch a lot of trout.
Yeah.
So I would spin fish, but then I was learning to fly fish. So he would put a fly rod in my hand and I would go out and fish. He would watch me for maybe a minute and he couldn't take it. And so he'd walk up beside me and he went, "Kid, I don't see how you catch any fish." But he didn't leave it at that. He proceeded to talk to me about, to think a little bit about what's happening with your fly.
Yeah.
It's not like spin fishing where you just throw it out and whatever happens, happens.
Right,
you know?
right.
So that was kind of like, oh, so it started to be possible for me to actually catch fish. And then, I mean, the real, when I got to know Tom better, was when he owned Winston. I got that rod, we had that correspondence. And then I was living in Pleasantville, New York, outside of New York City. And so Winston at that time was Tom Morgan, Glenn Brackett, and Jerry Seam, primarily. And they had some other, I don't know if Bucky was there working for them. There were other people working, but I saw those as the three primary people. Of course, Jerry is now semi-retired from Sage Rod Company. But, so they would, because they knew me a little bit and they knew that I had started to make rods. So they would visit with me back in Pleasantville, New York. And I remember Jerry going down to the basement with me to see me the way I was hand planing rods. And we talked a little bit about all that. And as an aside, you know, I started out of the Garrison book, which outlines how to make the Garrison method. And I remember Tom's comment about the Garrison book. Kind of a comment to Glenn. He goes, "Boy, how hard do you want to make it?"
We always joke about that book, yeah. It sure makes it seem hard.
Yeah. Well, and then all the math to figure out the, you know, slide rules and one thing.
Right.
So,
did Jerry ever make bamboo rods?
Jerry Seam?
Jerry Seam, yeah.
I don't think he was involved in the making of it. You know, it was a little funny, the bamboo rods in Winston. because I think Tom, he was running a business. So, and I talked with Tom about this, that he never got as much influence into the bamboo rods as he would have liked to. Because basically the glass rods and the graphite rods were more the money part of the business.
Sure, just a bigger share.
So basically he turned that mostly over to Glenn. And of course, Glenn learned a lot from Gary Howells, as did Tom. You know, so they went with that, basically the method that Gary turned over to.
Right. Because Tom had a deep love of bamboo, for sure.
Yeah,
We learned that pretty
yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
And I've heard the same thing about Lister. He really was working on the business and kind of the adoption of graphite and some of the other things that were going on at that
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
And, you know, because you asked about Jerry Seam, and one of the memories I have was being, well, the reason they would come to see me is they were going to the Suffern show, which was a huge show back east. At that time, it was probably the biggest show, and it was not a fly fishing only show. It was everything. There were even boats and
Sure.
conventional gear, but
Yeah.
there was a lot of fly fishing, and it was the show that people went to. And so they would come, and we would have dinner. I was married to a different woman at the time. We would have dinner and spend time, and that's when I got to know Tom. But I probably got to know Glenn more than I got to know Tom.
Yeah.
Actually, because Glenn was more deeply involved in the bamboo. But thinking about Jerry, I remember at the shows I would always cast all the Winston rods. And they had one rod that was just a real clunker. And it was their 8-foot 5-weight. It was a clunker.
This was a bamboo rod.
Yeah, it was a bamboo rod, and it just was not right. And so I talked to Jerry. I said, Jerry, and they had an 8-foot 6-weight that was spectacular. And so I said to Jerry, what's up with this? It's like, and he basically said, yeah, I know. We just haven't. I don't know, I mean, and I'm kind of thinking, well, it's not that hard to adjust it, you know,
Right.
to get it, but you know, they didn't for whatever reason. I mean, there's lots of, you know, there's a lot to rod design, but to me, it was an obvious thing to do that they hadn't done at the time. They may have done it later on.
Right. Maybe that was their 5-weight. What are your memories of Tom fishing with Tom?
I didn't fish, I never fished with Tom.
That's right, I remember that.
I never fished with Tom.
Yep.
And it's one of the regrets, but I feel like I fished with Tom.
You talked about fishing, right?
Because I've heard so many stories, and I've fished places, you know, where Tom fished. And actually, of course, Tom, after he was unable to move, Gene and I fished Odell Creek on, I guess it was the Wellington property. And Tom came in Moby with Jerry,
Right.
and they parked so that Tom, and he had like eagle vision. He had amazing vision.
Right.
So he was just sitting up on a bluff watching us fish. And one of the things he said, he goes, you know, there's not as much water as there used to be. And his theory was, talking to the manager there, that they weren't irrigating up on the bench anymore. So it could be that the irrigation water used to seep through the bench and feed Odell, but that it didn't anymore. No, so I've never fished with Tom, but we've talked about fishing a lot. And I mean, Tom, you know, there's so many memories of Tom, but some of them are when he would tell stories. You know, when Tom would tell stories about old-time Ennis, and because I had a glimpse of that. Now, I kind of came at the edge of old-time Ennis. But, you know, he would tell stories like the Tuffy Johnson story.
Yeah.
You know, about the guy at the bar who poops his pants, basically. And then Tom's own story about where he had gotten a new fly line.
Well, I don't know if I've heard that one.
Oh, you don't know that one?
Huh.
I mean, and the thing about when Tom, of course, Tom was in bed. He couldn't really move anything.
Right.
But he would be telling these stories, and he would laugh so hard himself he could hardly breathe. And he could hardly finish the story because he was laughing so hard.
Right. Yeah, he was delighted by those stories.
Yeah,
Sure.
and it and it was, I wish I had tape recorded, because I've tried to and you can't. You can't reproduce it the way Tom
There's something about being there, yeah.
Yeah, and also because, of course, Tom knew, like with the Tuffy Johnson story, he knew the name of the bartender.
Yep.
Where he went to high school, all this stuff,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
But no, so the flatline story was, Tom was going fishing in Antelope Basin, if you know where that is. It's, I take the road from Reynolds Pass over to Idaho. You go up there, there's a road going off to Antelope Basin. There was a lake back there that Tom had heard was really good. And so he had gone, I think he might have gone to West or somewhere. He'd gotten a brand new weight forward fly line. and he was fishing with a friend of his. And fishing was total zero. It was just dead. There was like nothing going on. And so they were like bored, and they're just like, oh man, this fishing is terrible. But they were at this lake, and there were a lot of prairie dogs around. And that would pop up out of their holes, right? So Tom takes his brand new fly line. He goes, I'm going to catch one of those guys. So he takes the fly line, puts like an overhand knot in it, so there's a loop surrounding the thing, and then he attaches one end of the fly to like a piece of sagebrush or something. And then he sits there and with the line, and he waits for the prairie dog to pop out of the hole.
So
the prairie dog pops up out of the hole. Tom goes, ah, I got you, you little bastard! And the prairie dog goes, and he goes, and he bit the line in half.
Right back at home.
So Tom, and it was an expensive line in those days too, you know. It was like, but to hear Tom tell it, I mean, it was just a remarkable.
So much about fly line.
Remarkable story.
Yeah, he had a great sense of humor. Wicked sense of humor.
Yeah. But and also, you know, the thing about Tom, in a way that he had a quality to him that was, he wouldn't quit.
Mm-hmm.
He would never give up on something that he believed in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not like that. I mean, but I think about Tom a lot, and it's funny because I've caught fish because of Tom.
Mm-hmm.
Because Tom would always approach a difficult fish about, how am I going to catch that fish? And he'd figure out exactly how to do it. Yeah. Whereas I go and I look at it and I go, I'm probably never going to catch that.
Oh, put him down again. Yeah.
So I've had that happen where I've come up to like fish like that, and I think of Tom. I go, no, Tom wouldn't have that. He would figure out how to get them, and then you take your time to figure out the best angle, to get the drift, all of that stuff, you know. And I've caught fish because of this. So in a way, I have fished with Tom.
Right.
I mean, the other thing was the first steelhead I ever caught was in the Trinity River in California. And everybody told me, like at the casting clubs in California, if you go steelhead fishing, it'll change your life. And I was like, nothing's going to change my life. But it did.
Yeah.
It's like steelhead fishing changed my whole thing about fishing. It was so exciting and wild. And so I had caught fish on the Trinity, but that's almost like trout fishing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of times you'll find steelhead actually rising to flies on the Trinity. Yep. And when you find them like that, it's like taking candy from a baby. Because they're saltwater fish that arise, you know, that they have that uncontrollable urge from when they were a little par in the river. You know? Yeah. So if you get a decent drift of that fly to them, they're going to eat it.
Yeah.
You know? But then I started going up to British Columbia to fish steelhead on the Maurice River. And Tom had fished the Maurice a lot. And Tom would go up with a group of other anglers who would all fish wet flies. And Tom would fish dry flies.
Right.
And Tom was really proud because he would normally do as well as the wet fly guys. And so Tom, in fact, he wrote up a piece, and I still have it up in my shop, about how to dry fly fish for steelhead. I mean, things like, that you take 2 steps between each cast. Or you make a cast, and he said never make more than 2 false casts. Make 2 false, and carry, depending on what the pool is.
And this was all single hand rods at the time,
Oh, yeah.
right? Yeah.
And he said, on a big pool, you want to cover as much water as you can, but don't try to cast too much line, because then you're going to have loose line when the fly hits the water. So the fly won't be fishing until 20 feet down the river when it tightens up. So you want to throw as good a straight line as you can at a comfortable distance and just comb the pool. He also said always make a cast before you step into the water. Because a lot of times, especially up there, early in the morning, if you're the first guy there, steelhead will be in really shallow water.
Close, yeah.
Just kind of laying there, and if you drift a dry fly, they'll just... But so he would walk me through the whole thing about how to cast and step and watch, and always watch your fly. Because a lot of times you might not see the fish go for the fly, but you might see a funny disturbance. Like a fish that flashed at the fly, a fish that came up close to it and bulged the water. That's a fish that you can catch.
Right.
Because that's a fish that moved to your fly. So you always keep the same length of line, And so, like when I was there fishing, it was like Tom was on my shoulder talking to me.
Sure.
About, well, no, you didn't do that quite right. You should have done this first. But he never told me I was hopeless.
Right. Yeah, that's nice.
But so anyway, that was a really neat thing, and of course I did catch a lot of steelhead, including that he used bombers tied by W.W. Doak in New Brunswick, which is where I got all my bombers for years. So one time I was talking with Tom, I was giving him a report about the steelhead fishing. And I was telling him about, because a lot of times you do a lot of casting and stepping with nothing happening.
I'm sure.
And it's actually a wonderful experience to be on the river, just being in the water, watching your fly. And I was talking to Tom about it. I said, it's just such a great experience. It's like a meditation. And he goes, yeah, that's the great thing about steelhead dry fly fishing. The fish don't interrupt you very often.
Right. Lots of time to meditate.
Yeah, well, and
I
actually,
love getting those reports, by the way, I think. Like, you have people that would stop in and they would
of
they fish,
course.
because he remembered fishing so many of these places.
Yeah.
And I think the less he was able to do it, the more his mind fulfilled it, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
You could imagine it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where you stood, where you cast, all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so anyway, I was talking about like the unique quality that Tom had about getting an idea and not giving up on it. To me, the best example are these hand mills.
Right.
Because I think Bob Clay already had a prototype and was working with it a little bit, but Tom was still very much in the design testing phase. And so I would come up from California and spend time, trying different things, cutting sticks, seeing how things were working. And one of the big glitches that we had early on was to adjust the taper of the anvil was too cumbersome. You actually had to take this off of its bed and readjust it, and then attach it back to the bed to readjust the taper. And to me that was just too cumbersome. And Tom basically agreed that it needed work, and I was ready to. I went to bed that night. It's like, cool idea, but it ain't gonna fit. It's just that's not gonna. If you can't do that, it's not gonna work. And I just slept on it, and I would always wake up in the morning I would go in and say good morning to Tom. He'd be in bed, and he had a little smirk on his face. And I walked in, I said, good morning, Tom. And he goes, hi, Bear. And he goes, I figured it out. And it was just, basically it was just a way of being able to get at the bottom of the hand mill to adjust the push-pull screws. And that was, and then of course the other thing about Tom, he learned so much from customers, people who used the hand mill. Like, I forget who it was that came up with the stop.
Oh, right.
Was that Hartzell maybe? But somebody came up, and that's a really significant step, because I had the old original hand mill.
Yep.
It worked well, but I also a couple times went too far, because you just kind of get, a brain fart, So to have that stop is really, really.
You can set it and forget it, kind of. Yep. Oh.
But so, to me, and also the hand mill, going back to when Tom and Glenn and Jerry would visit me in Pleasantville, New York. Glenn said to me, because I was hand planing on planing forms, he goes, Tom, and this is like in the early 80s, he goes, Tom has an idea that's totally different from that. He thinks you guys are doing an ass backwards. The way you cut both sides at once.
Yeah.
And I'm going, let's see it.
That'd be nice, yeah.
And so what was it? 20 years later or 18 years later?
Yeah. That's
It
about all
actually,
it took, right? Yeah.
because Tom didn't have, he was running a business and
Sure.
there were a lot of other things to deal with. So, to me it's amazing that he would have that, the way he was, I guess it's probably an IQ thing. I would love to know what his IQ was.
Yeah, I don't know.
I bet it was
pretty
almost as high as Donald Trump, I'm sure.
Maybe.
Maybe almost.
Yeah, he had a great memory for things.
Yeah.
And you're right, that stick-to-itiveness. It's a great story because 18 years later, he comes out with it.
Yeah.
And I think he had the ability to leave things and come back to them really easy without having that huge ramp up. Okay, what was I doing now? What was this thing going to be about? Yeah, he could just dive right back in. Yeah.
Well, and of course there was something from his way of looking, because he had run a milling machine. So to him it was natural to do it the way that he came up with the idea for the hand mill.
Right.
And by the way, it was me who came up with the name for the hand mill.
Oh, nice.
I forget what they... I don't know that they had a name for it yet. But I was the one who came up with the hand mill. And...
Did you put the Morgan in it?
No. No, I just called it the hand mill.
Yeah, no.
Because it was basically a milling cutter.
Yeah, hand powered milling.
Used by hand.
Yep.
And it is true that, having a bed that goes up and down like this in terms of setting the taper, conceptually, taper-wise, it's cleaner than planing forms.
Yeah, there's something about the orientation of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Planing forms are a little more abstracted from what the taper is. They're fine. There's lots of great rods that have been, and I made,
for sure.
I don't know how many rods I made, but up until Tom designed the hand mill, everything was done, on planing forms.
Yep.
And one of the problems, especially on quad butt sections, I would probably lose 40% of my quad butt sections to glue lines or bad angles or something. And the hand mill basically took care of that because it's automatically the right angle.
Yeah. And it's repeatable. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you can make it the same. Interesting. Yeah, I always thought it was remarkable to make a tool like that but never use it.
Yeah.
And it just,
he watched it being used.
Right, watched it being used, but I think there's some selflessness or maybe it's a lack of ego that goes with that, to design something for other people to use or that you can't use yourself.
Yeah, but you know what, Joel? This whole thing, like even him owning Winston, of course there are the realities of money and making a business work, but he did it because he loved it.
Right.
That's where he was coming from. That was the basis of, so that's why I think it was very natural for him to share ideas. And then he would, you have to find a way to make it economically viable,
Right.
but that's not what it's about.
Right.
What it's about is that passion that he had for design and for fishing and how they melded into creating something.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a great summation of it. Yeah. Huh. What do you think is the hand mill his lasting contribution? What do you think his contribution to rod making is?
Well, the hand mill is huge. But really, I think it's, to me, the more important thing is the feel of his rods. You know, his rods had a particular sweet feel, usually pretty light in the tip, but sweet and smooth. That, I haven't paid much attention to Winston lately, but boy, that feel carried on at Winston for many, many years after he left.
Right.
It's one of the things that interests me in rods is when you see the spirit of somebody who's long gone still carry on. Like H.L. Leonard, you see that for a long, long time, basically for 80 years. I mean, in my opinion, until the fire in '64, then Leonard was kind of all done, in my not so humble opinion.
Right.
No, I think Tom's feel for rods, and just the terminology, like the unity with the universe,
Sure.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a mysticism to things like that, right?
Yeah.
Kind of yeah.
Well, I had such great talks with Tom about rod design and about that feel. And one of the discussions we had was about if you make a rod, so you make an 8-foot 4-line rod, and it's one of those unity with the universe rods. It's just like,
Yeah.
you know, it's
An
just.
extension of yourself.
And so then you would think you should be able to translate that design into, say, an 8.5 foot 5-weight, right? You should be able to, and it never happens.
Right.
You might be able to make a good rod, but it won't have that same thing. And we also talked about, like he said, his 8.5 foot 7 line. That's why he called that the unity with the universe rod, because there's a certain design idea, type of material, mandrel, all of that stuff. It's like everything falls together in a certain rod model. And people who are in the business and who know rods know what those rod models are.
Right. Yeah, it's like a sweet spot.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily transfer to the other rods.
Exactly.
Same material.
Well, like one of the
different
fabulous,
finish.
exactly.
Yeah.
A fabulous rod is the old Sage
Hello?
7 foot 9 inch 3-weight LL.
Yep.
It's one of those rods. Wow.
Yep.
And I think that's when Ray Jeff was still the designer.
I think so, yeah.
Sage, actually. I've always liked Ray Jeff's. He has really fast tapers in the end of the tip, which is what I happen to like.
Yeah, once you capture it, it's not easy to recreate it. You can sprinkle that dust over on the rods and have them all feel that way. Yeah.
Well, and you know the Winston Special Streamer, right?
Yep.
8 foot 3 inch.
Yep.
So, of course, Tom designed because he wanted to make that rod, right? And so he made a number of them, and I came up because he always wanted to know what I thought about different things. And so I came up, and he thought he had it, you know. And I came up, and I cast them both, and I said, "Boy, it's a nice rod, and it's not the same." And he was kind of like, he was like, "Well, deflect's the same," and I said, "Yeah, doesn't feel the same." And then Tom and I talked about it, we chased it down that the tip didn't weigh the same. And I forget if it was heavier or lighter, but that's where the feel difference was.
Yeah, that has been one of the giant lessons for us in this prayer. I'd love for you to talk about it, how deflection doesn't always equal action. You can take two rods and
because
deflect
it's
the
static.
same. Right.
It's static. It's not dealing with the weight of the rod, particularly the weight of the tip. Because any little change in the weight of the tip, for the average guy, it's probably not gonna matter. But for guys who love rods and want a very particular feel, like you're trying to make that rod like that, you like that special streamer rod,
Right.
you want everything to be just so,
Yeah.
And so basically Tom chased it down and basically got there.
Yeah. Right.
And one of the things also, around those same things, around weight, especially the weight of the tip. I heard from a customer of Tom's and a customer of mine, and we were talking, and he told me that Tom, when he still owned Winston, that on certain, maybe it was on the Stalker series rods, that Tom would use pure stainless steel guides without the chrome plating because of the little bit of extra weight from the chrome plating. And when the guy said that, I said, no way. No way, that's not, there's no enough of it. So sometime later I remembered, and I asked Tom about it, and Tom goes, yep, I did. And it made a difference. And I mean, it is true that it's remarkable well, I mean, in my case, we were talking before about the that square rod that I was making with the square front.
Yeah.
So I made one that's hollow built and one that's solid. And the difference in the weight of the tip is 1.2 grams. And the difference on the two rods is huge.
Really? Huh.
1.2 grams is not very much.
No, that's like nothing. Yeah. Huh. But it's a difference.
Yeah.
Tom always told us, he said that the blanks are perfect. And the more you do them, especially at the tip, the more you mess them up.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he told us when he started doing this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the only thing I would say.
He spent a lot of work getting those blanks where he wanted them, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, it is true, and where you can weigh a rod down with too many guides, or, you know, some people are putting guides that are too big.
Right.
That's another thing that Tom, you know, he did tests with Jeremy Seam, and he proved that the smaller guides, the line flows as well or better than with, and that all you do with the big guides is put more weight into the, especially the tip of the rod. There's no reason to do that.
I just read a chapter in an old lefty credit book, and he talks about how you can't shoot line through small strippers because he thinks the line is like a waveform and bunch up the stripper and create.
Yeah, and I've heard that from a lot of.
Yeah, that's kind of the dominant theory of the other side, right?
Yeah, and I just go, you know what? I just don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, well,
Right.
I think Bruce probably believes that, doesn't he?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never really asked him directly.
I think if you asked him,
Yeah.
he'd probably.
Yeah.
Because he's in with that whole gang of scientists from California.
Yeah.
Done all
And
those
distance
things.
casters and
Yeah, and they
competition
did
stuff.
all kinds of, you know, analysis, video, high-speed video, and that.
Mhm.
So, you know, the thing is, what it boils down to is a knowledgeable, sensitive guy casting the rod.
Right.
You know, and to me, that guy is infinitely more sensitive than these computers, like people try to, design rods with computers.
Mhm.
I mean, you can maybe get some ballpark help
Mhm.
with computers,
Yeah, here's a
but,
good point. Yeah.
but in terms of getting those really quintessential rods, you're not going to get there.
Mhm.
I mean, and that's the Tom. Tom and I had that discussion a lot, and he said, "Yeah, it's just," and he also knew that a lot of people. You would think everybody in the rod business has a great feel for rods. Not true.
Mhm.
There are a lot of people in the rod business who really don't get it.
I've always thought, and I don't know, I kind of made this opinion of my own, or whatever you think of it. I've always thought that your background before you start making rods really informs the way you make rods.
Oh, sure.
And Tom was a fisherman first, so I think he always was trying to solve problems that people encounter while they're fishing.
E.C. Powell the same way.
Right.
Paul
Right.
Young,
What makes
same
people a
thing.
better fisherman, or what problem am I trying to solve? It's never, for Tom, it was never shooting line at your feet
Right.
in a competition. It was always, how can I accurately present a fly and a fish I can see?
Right.
Or have sense, or protect tippet while I'm catching a fish.
Yeah, and he talks about that in all the stuff you still have on the website.
Right.
In the discussions about rod design.
Right.
And you see it at the shows. People step up to the thing and they always want to heave
Right.
a long line over the end of the platform.
Right, cast out of the pond.
And so one of the story about Jerry Sean, I think it was at the Marlboro, one of the New England shows, and this is years ago. He was working for Sage at the time, I guess, and he wanted to cast one of my rods, and I had a 7.5 foot 3-way hollow build quad.
Mm-hmm.
So he cast that, and he just starts casting. He's still my favorite caster to watch.
Mm-hmm.
He's so natural and so smooth, and all these guys go whoa, 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 and then they're all struggling, and Jerry doesn't even get up on the platform.
Yeah.
He stands behind the platform with a little double taper 3 and just lays it easily over the end of the thing. And people are like, and with a 3-way line and a bamboo rod. And I said, well, yeah, but the thing is, Jerry can do that with no rod at all.
Right. Just with his hands. Yeah. Yep.
And he used to do that at the suffrage show. He would put on a white glove like Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
He'd put on a white glove and he'd do a bare hand casting it. And I would say to him, I said, Jerry, you work for a rod company.
Right.
It's like, why are you showing people you can do it without even having them?
Funny. How do you think fishing's changed since fly fishing has changed since you started making rods? Do you think people still appreciate bamboo rods? Is it more about catching fish or going to far out locales? What have you seen?
Well, there's too many people fishing.
Right.
You know, I mean, the big rivers are overrun. And to me, it's a sad thing that I read somewhere they estimate that in the Madison River, the average fish is caught like 4 to 6 times a year.
Yeah. Yep.
That just ain't right.
Right.
You know, it's
hard
like
to fish, yeah.
I mean, well, and also for me, it's like fishing is about connecting with something that's wild and not us in our control, you know, highways, and it's like connecting with something that's truly a wild energy. And anymore, you hook these fish and it's like, oh, okay, we're going to go through this again.
They know the program.
Same thing on the Henry's Fork, the Missouri. Once in a while you'll get a fish that maybe hasn't been. But so, you know, we go fish places we never heard of, basically. But, and the other thing there's, I mean, this is kind of controversial, but I'm going to say it. I think guides have ruined fly fishing. There's too many guides. And I say that, guides taught me how to fly fish in the 60s.
Right. Sure. Yep.
There's just too many guides, and there's too much fishing pressure, and they give away all the secrets, and these fish are under pressure from boats all the time with very effective fishing methods like nymph and indicator, Euro nymphing. You know, it's a very effective way to fish.
Right.
To me, it's not a particularly fun way to fish. But a lot of people just want to float down a river and say that they caught a fish.
Right.
You know, I grew up in a very different time, and I really appreciate some of the very traditional, like the Old English, you know, the North Country spider stuff. And,
Yeah.
just a very different kind of, like our friend Jeff down in Last Chance, he showed me fly. Well, I don't know, you might not fish this, because I won't fish a foam fly.
Yeah. Huh.
And there's a lot of flies that just won't fish.
Yeah.
Because I've caught a ton of fish.
Right.
So I don't need to catch another fish. But I do need to have an experience of beauty and of being connected to something wild and natural,
Right.
where you're just astonished at the way the whole thing works.
Right.
You know, just to me, the basic reality, the sun comes up every morning, so far. You know, the rivers are flowing, there's fish in them. I mean, to me, that's what it is. And the other thing about fly fishing now, it's partially because of guides. It's all about size and numbers.
Right.
How'd you do? how'd you do? Oh, I got 42 from 14 to 17
Right.
inches.
Right.
So how'd you do? You know, what kind of a day did you have? Did you have an experience that moved you or changed you, or
Right.
is it all just about numbers for you? For a lot of people, it is all about numbers. That's all they know. And to me,
Right.
that's sad.
Right. Sure. Yeah. We talk about that a lot. You know, we have customers kind of across the spectrum. We talk about how when you start fly fishing, you just want to catch a fish on the fly,
Right.
whatever it takes. If it's
Right.
nymphing or it's an indicator or whatever, and then you get to the point where you just want to catch a lot of fish and you
Yeah.
count. And,
Yeah.
and I feel like we have so many people in that category right now. But hopefully, the people that stick with it, they then become people who just want to catch big fish. And then the last stage we see is people who just want to catch a fish on natural fibers on a dry fly, or they just want to go somewhere that they have that experience with the whole of the experience, the nature, the surroundings, where they are, who they're with, all those things come into it. Or they say, I'm just going to fish, one fly this whole day, and I want to see what happens. They pick their methods and what they want to do for their fulfillment. But it does feel like there's a lot of people in those early stages now because the sport is exploding.
Yeah.
There's so many people that are
And I mean, it's
towards that.
understandable that people want to catch fish because it looks like that's what it's about.
Sure, it does
It's
on the
actually
surface.
not.
Right, and it's not. Yeah, you're right. And that's an awful hard thing to teach somebody that's starting
What
out.
is, I think it wasn't it Thoreau who said, many men fish their whole life without realizing it's not fish that they're after.
Right. Yep. Exactly right. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. I talked about too, and I think Matt and I are always conscious of this because of our time with Tom is the role that Jerry played kind of in the successes the company had and really the founding of the company and the continuation of the company. And just your impressions, because I know obviously you work with your wife Jean and you guys are close there and you do as part of the partnership.
Yeah, I don't really work with Jean in my business.
Right.
I mean, she's tried a little bit, but that's
Right.
not part of it. But so one thing Tom always said, it was true when he ran Winston also, he preferred to work with women.
Well, Tom loved women, right? We've had
Yeah.
several people.
No, I think there is that. There
but
is
he had
that.
an affinity
There-
for
there's-
working with
There's
them as well.
definitely that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the stuff about rods, like the attention to detail and understanding and seeing subtle things, I think a lot of times women are better at that.
Sure.
It comes more naturally to them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jerry had a background, she was thinking about becoming a violin maker, right?
Right.
So she had that bent already, so it was a pretty natural fit. And of course, it took a lot of training from Tom to get her up to speed on all that.
Right.
So I think that was a pretty natural thing. And then, and Jerry's really proud of the work that she did. Like when you and I went up to British Columbia for her to get that award. I think that meant a lot to her.
Right.
To get recognition, because it's always the guys. It's
Sure.
not a lot of the people behind it.
Yeah, we always think of the story of the company as kind of the story of their relationship almost as much. Like the two things happen so concurrently.
Right.
And together, if they hadn't had the relationship they did, I mean, I don't know if I could teach my wife how to make a fly.
Oh, he
wheelchair.
needed
Yeah.
something to physically realize it.
Right.
I mean, like that's why I came up when we were just working on this. It's all Tom's ideas, but he needed somebody's perspective who knew a little bit about rod making, actually using it and to say, well, it's doing this, it's doing that.
Right.
It's never going to work, Tom. Forget it.
I'm on to the next thing. Well, I got 18 years to work on it, so. Interesting. What's next for you, Paris? You finished the book. What's next?
Good question.
Is there another project on the horizon?
Well, I mean, people want me to do a book about my own building, and I may do that. I probably will do that. But I really want to get, I was a photographer for years. Like I have work at the National Library in Paris, the Fogg Art Museum. I'm a serious photographer. And there are some things I want to get back to there. The problem with that, it makes no money.
Well, right.
but
Being a starving artist isn't as glamorous as it seems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so there's some things, I'm 68, and it kind of feels like there's some visions I've had for a long time that I want to complete in terms of that. And there's a bunch of a bunch of rod designs I still want to work on. There's a bunch of things that grew out of E.C. Powell's designs that have really thrown me for a loop because they're conceptually they're the opposite of what I've built for the last 38 years.
Right.
And I like them. And it's like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting with bamboo rod making. There's always something,
Yeah.
isn't there? Yeah, or something you can try.
Yeah.
Huh.
It's something I would have loved to have had a chance to put into Tom's hands. Although, it would have been it would have been a very interesting discussion to talk about some of those tip action E.C. Powell rods and the balancing act of getting things right there. I mean, and so Gene and I yesterday went up to Yellowstone Park, and we went without rods. We went just to hike and look at some tricky streams that we had heard about that people don't fish much.
Yeah.
It was a gift to not have a fly rod in my hand.
Yeah.
To just be walking and looking, and because it's distracting. You get that. Oh, let me see what.
Yeah, there's a predatory instinct, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Competitive drive that kicks in.
So that was really just wonderful.
Huh. Did you see fish?
We did not see fish.
Huh.
But the main stream we looked at is one of those streams. I'm sure you know these streams. A little stream with lots of serious undercut banks.
Sure.
You don't see the fish in those
Yeah,
streams because they're under those banks.
Not in the daylight. Yeah, yep.
So, maybe if we had a hopper and threw it out there, they would have come out from that bank and took it. And maybe there's no fish in there, who knows?
Right. Huh. It's part of the adventure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Cool.
I loved what Ernie Schwiebert said at a talk he gave at the American Museum. Whatever you think of Schwiebert, and I have mixed feelings about him myself, but he was very inspirational in his writings for me early on in fly fishing. And towards the end of his life, he was giving this talk and he said, people ask me why I fish. And he goes, I fish because of beauty. And that's true, that really is, and I think that's closer to what we're after than just catching fish. And by the way, in terms of size and numbers of fish, when I was 13, I one time caught 72 sunfish in less than an hour on a fly rod. And I was so proud of myself.
You must have been an expert on hooking fish.
Well, yeah, you barbed this hook and you catch them.
Right
You
back.
pretty much just flip it in there and you've got another one.
I think that's a high watermark for sure, right?
Well, Tom caught, I can't remember, I think it was 156 fish on the Jefferson River in one day, fishing with, I think it was McFeeters?
Yeah.
And one other really good angler.
Yeah.
And I think McFeeters got 42.
Yeah, they were
the other guy got
50.
60.
Yeah.
And Tom, I got 156.
Well, it's funny you say
because he
that.
was fishing the Morgan Twitch.
Yeah, it was in the Morgan Twitch, the Gorman bug, yep. And he counted fish. Always counted fish.
Well, on a day like that, how could you not?
Better keep track, Yep, that's a lot of fish.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, thanks so much for your time, Per.
Yeah, sure.
It's so nice to talk to you and get some of your thoughts.
Yeah, good. No, it was a pleasure and glad
You
to.
bet.
There's a lot more where that came from. Although those are some good highlights.
Right on. Great. Thanks again.
Great. Thank
Okay.
you.